been listening to a lot of gospel jazz recently, which is a beautiful subgenre of jazz that obviously takes elements of gospel and applies them to jazz. And like all subgenres, there are certain patterns and ideas that are widely used and reused, and that's really the reason why a particular style sounds the way it does. And one of these patterns is a particular chord progression that is very widely used in gospel-influenced or soulful jazz. And it is the 1 major going to a 5-1 in the relative minor key, then back to a 1 dominant, followed by a 4-1 plagal cadence. Now in gospel-influenced jazz, we tend to use just triads for major and minor chords, and then the full 7th chord for dominant chords. So this chord progression in the key of C would start on the 1, it would start on C, then go E7 to A minor, which is our relative minor, then goes back to C7, which is our dominant 1, and then F and C, which is our plagal cadence at the end. And it sounds like this. Right, nice and simple, mostly using triads to get that slightly purer sound, except for those dominant chords that naturally create little 5-1 movements. Now, this is kind of the base chord progression, but there are numerous variations, or there are numerous extra little passing chords you can add to make this a little bit more interesting. For example, instead of heading straight into a 5-1 in the relative minor, in A minor in this case, you could turn that into a 2-5-1. Or instead of going to the 1 dominant, so the C7 in our case, you could go straight from that A minor to an F and then to your C. Or at the very end, instead of going from your 4 chord to your 1 to create that plagal cadence, so it's F to C in our case, you could break that up by going 4 sharp 4 diminished chords, so an F sharp dominant, then to the 1. So they're all slight variations on our sort of original foundational archetypal chord progression, but we're essentially just adding, an extra chord or omitting a chord, but it more or less has the same overall feel as our sort of original chord progression. So that's the chord progression covered. And in terms of the scale, you'll often find that these gospel-y, soulful jazz songs often just use the major pentatonic scale, so the C major pentatonic over this chord progression in C. And occasionally you will find a song that just uses the plain major scale. Now, as a little aside, this isn't super important, but in terms of analysing this chord progression, it obviously starts on the 1, then it goes 5-1 in your relative minor, then 5-4 dominant going to your 4-1 plagal cadence. Alternately, you could treat that E7 as a 5-6 secondary dominant, so it would go 1, 5-6, 6, 5-4, 4-1. But again, if that didn't make sense to you, don't worry too much about that, that's just a little harmonic analysis for you. So a good example of a song that uses this chord progression is Georgia on My Mind. Right, so we're now in the key of F, and the melody just uses the F pentatonic scale. We add the E in there at the end, but primarily just the pentatonic scale. And the chord progression is that sort of gospel-y archetypal chord progression. We start on the 1, F major, then sometimes you'll see a 2-5 or just a regular 5-1 going to the relative minor. But then we don't go back to the 1 dominant, instead we go straight to the 4, and then a sharp 4 diminished, then back to the 1. Right, so just a slight variation on our original chord progression. Another great example of this is the beautiful song by Billy Taylor called I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free. Now that's also in the key of F, and it goes as follows. Right, so again, the melody is just the F pentatonic scale. And our chord progression starts on the 1, F, then goes 5-1 to the D minor, relative minor, then hits that 1 dominant, F7, then goes to the 4, B flat, back to the 1. So that's kind of the bass melody and chord progression. But of course, to make it sound even more gospel-y, we can use other techniques that are widely found in gospel jazz or gospel piano to make it really, full and nice and gospel sounding. Now these techniques are using octaves, using tremolos, using diminished passing chords, using couple chords or approach or neighbor passing chords. So using all those ideas, we could get something like this. So by putting in those nice full octave heavy chords both in the bass and in the actual melody at the top, so essentially doubling everything in octaves, you get a much nicer and fuller arrangement of the song that sounds a lot more gospel-y. Now the same is true for Hymn to Freedom. Now that's in the key of B flat and it goes as follows. Right, so in this case the melody is using the B flat major scale. But the chord progression is our standard archetypal gospel chord progression. Starts on the 1, goes to a 5-1 in the relative minor, goes to the 1 dominant, then goes to the 4, sharp 4 diminished, goes back to the 1. And again, you could fill that out and make it nice and thick and dense and gospel-y by again putting in those techniques, octaves, tremolos, those types of things. Right, beautiful song by Oscar Peterson, uses the same chord progression but with the major scale more than the pentatonic. So we could take this kind of template chord progression and some of the other techniques that I briefly mentioned in this video, and we can apply it to a traditional hymn, especially one where the melody just uses a major pentatonic scale, and by doing so we can give it a nice gospel-y feel. So a good example of this is the classic Amazing Grace. Now the melody only uses the pentatonic scale, so it's going to fit quite well. Again, in the key of F. Right, exclusively the pentatonic scale. So taking our template chord progression and putting in, those octaves and tremolos and things like that, we could create something like this. Right, so there I did all the things we discussed in this video. So here I took the melody exactly as written, doubled it an octave lower, and then put in the other notes of the chord as we went through the progression. And of course I substituted in our template gospel jazz chord progression. So I started on the F, jumped up an inversion, to get the melody note A, then walked through a little passing chord, so from the F to a G minor back to the F. Jumped up to the A7, which is our 5 of the relative minor. Then hit the minor, of course, with the melody note on top, so in first inversion. Then jump down to get the 4/1 cadence, again with the melody note on top. So again, nice and slowly. And that's it. So melody doubled with the rest of the chord in the middle, following through that template chord progression that we've been discussing in this video. And as I mentioned, melody uses the major pentatonic. So those few things together, including the tremolos, really give this a nice full gospel-y sound. And I think this chord progression works quite well over this melody. So you can give that a go yourself. Find another sort of gospel-y hymn that ideally uses the major pentatonic scale. Figure out what key it's in, obviously, and then try substitute this chord progression in over the melody. See if it works, see if you like the sound, see if it sounds interesting to you. Because I think it's quite an interesting, really nice sounding and versatile little chord progression, as it has that perfect cadence to the relative minor, and then plagal cadence giving you that amen feel at the end there to take you back to the tonic. And that's it. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you've enjoyed this. See you next time. Bye.